The evening air held a gentle chill as a young teen made his way home from the local library, his backpack heavy with books and study materials. At just 14 years old, he was already showing promise, maintaining straight A's and dreaming of following in his father's entrepreneurial footsteps. The street lamps cast long shadows across the manicured lawns of the upscale neighborhood he called home. Officer Tom Miller cruised slowly through the quiet streets in his patrol car, the same route he'd taken hundreds of times before. Something caught his eye. A figure walking alone, hands in pockets, hood pulled up against the cool air. The officer's years of ingrained biases instantly kicked in, despite the completely ordinary scene before him. The teen noticed the police car slowing beside him and felt his heart rate quicken, though he knew he had every right to be there. He'd grown up hearing his parents' careful instructions about how to behave if law enforcement ever stopped him. Keep your hands visible. Speak clearly and respectfully. Move slowly. Don't make any sudden movements. Hey you. Stop right there. Officer Miller's voice cut sharply through the evening quiet as he stepped out of his vehicle, one hand already resting on his equipment belt. The teen froze, carefully turning to face the officer while keeping his hands in clear view. "Good evening, officer," he said steadily, though his voice wavered slightly. "Is something wrong?" Rather than answer, Miller barked another command. "What are you doing in this neighborhood? Let me see some ID." "Sir, I live just 3 houses down," the teen explained calmly, fighting to keep his voice level despite his rising fear. "I'm coming back from studying at the library. I can show you my student ID." But before he could slowly reach for his wallet, Miller's taser was already drawn. The teen's eyes widened in disbelief and terror as he realized what was about to happen. "Wait, please," he began. Several neighbors, drawn by the commotion, emerged from their homes. One began recording on their phone as Miller shouted commands that contradicted each other, leaving the frightened teen frozen in confusion. In a split second that would change everything, Miller pulled the trigger. The sharp crack of the taser firing echoed through the previously peaceful street. The teen's body went rigid as the barbs struck him, sending him crumpling to the ground. Through the haze of pain, he managed to gasp out his father's phone number to a concerned neighbor who had rushed to help. What Officer Miller couldn't have known was that the teen he'd just tased was the son of one of the city's most prominent business leaders, a man who'd built a technology empire from the ground up and was known for his philanthropic work throughout the community. A man who was about to receive a call that would make his blood run cold. Within minutes, the quiet street transformed into a scene of barely contained chaos. Emergency vehicles arrived with flashing lights, concerned neighbors gathered in clusters, and smartphones captured every moment. Officer Miller stood to the side, the reality of his actions beginning to sink in as he learned more about who the teen actually was. His face grew pale as he realized this incident wouldn't be easily swept under the rug like so many others before it. But this was just the beginning of a story that would shake their community to its core and force everyone to confront uncomfortable truths about prejudice, power, and the long road to real change. The question wasn't just about one officer's actions anymore. It was about an entire system that needed to change. Officer Miller's heart raced as he stood over the teen, his hand still gripping the taser. Something felt different this time, a gnawing feeling in his gut that wouldn't go away. Around him, neighbors had gathered on their perfectly manicured lawns, many with phones raised, capturing every second of what was unfolding. "He lives here, Tom. He lives right down the street." A woman's voice cut through the tension. Mrs. Chen, who'd lived in the neighborhood for 20 years, stepped forward despite her usual shyness. "I see him walking to school every morning. His family's been here longer than most of us." The teen remained on the ground, his body still trembling from the taser's shock. His school books had scattered across the sidewalk, AP Physics and Advanced Calculus textbooks lying open on the concrete. A college brochure from MIT peeked out from his partially unzipped backpack. Officer Miller's radio crackled with questions from dispatch, but he barely heard them. His eyes were fixed on the teen's student ID card that had fallen nearby, the school's prestigious logo clearly visible, along with an honor roll designation. The reality of his hasty judgment began to sink in, heavy as lead in his stomach. More neighbors emerged from their homes, drawn by the commotion. Mr. Thompson, a retired judge, approached with purpose in his stride. "Officer, I hope you realize the gravity of what just happened here. This young man walks past my house every day, always polite, always respectful. What made you think he didn't belong?" The question hung in the air, uncomfortable and demanding. Miller shifted his weight, struggling to find words that wouldn't come. His training hadn't prepared him for this moment, when his unconscious biases were laid bare for everyone to see. A sleek black car screeched to a halt at the scene. The teen's father emerged, his usual composed businessman demeanor cracking at the sight of his son on the ground. He wore an expensive suit, but in that moment, he was simply a terrified parent. Behind him, the family's lawyer quickly followed, already on the phone. "What happened to my son?" The father's voice carried the weight of controlled fury. He knelt beside the teen, checking him over with trembling hands. "I was in a board meeting when I got the call. My son, my straight-A student who's never been in trouble a day in his life, got tased walking home from the library." Officer Miller's face drained of color as recognition hit him. He knew exactly who this man was. His company's name was on half the buildings downtown. The teen he profiled as suspicious was the son of one of the most influential business leaders in the city. The gathering crowd grew larger. Phones continued recording. Someone had called local news stations, and the first news van was already pulling up. The story was spreading across social media like wildfire. The son of a prominent businessman, tased by police while walking home from studying. The father helped his son sit up, supporting him carefully. The teen's eyes met Officer Miller's, and in that moment, the officer saw something that would haunt him. Not anger or hatred, but disappointment and hurt. The kind of look that made you question everything you thought you knew about yourself. "Dad," the teen said softly, his voice still shaky, "I did everything like you taught me. I kept my hands where he could see them. I spoke respectfully. I didn't make any sudden moves. It didn't matter." Those words cut through the evening air like a knife, leaving everyone in stunned silence. The father pulled his son closer, protective and heartbroken all at once. Around them, the neighborhood that had seemed so peaceful just an hour ago now felt charged with tension and the weight of uncomfortable truths that could no longer be ignored. This wasn't just going to be another incident report filed away and forgotten. As news vans continued to arrive and social media lit up with footage of the incident, it was clear that this moment would force their community to confront some hard truths about prejudice, power, and what it really means to protect and serve. The scene transformed into a whirlwind of activity as paramedics arrived to check on the teen. They worked quickly but gently, their practiced hands examining the taser's impact points while speaking in soft, reassuring tones. The father never left his son's side, his protective presence a stark contrast to the chaos unfolding around them. "Sir, we'd recommend taking him to the hospital for a full evaluation," one paramedic advised, noting how the teen's hands still trembled slightly. "While the immediate effects of the taser have worn off, we want to make sure there are no underlying issues." The father nodded, his jaw tight with controlled emotion. Their family lawyer was already documenting everything, taking photos of the taser barb's entry points and gathering contact information from witnesses. Neighbors who'd recorded the incident were sending their videos directly to him, building an undeniable record of what had transpired. Officer Miller stood off to the side, his earlier authority deflated. His supervisor had arrived and pulled him aside for what appeared to be an intense conversation. The officer's body camera footage would tell its own story, one that wouldn't match any report trying to justify his actions. Local news crews had set up their equipment, their cameras capturing the aftermath. The teen's father, despite his visible anger and worry, spoke with remarkable composure to a reporter. My son was walking home from the library. He's 14 years old. He had his school books with him. The only thing that made him suspicious was the color of his skin. The statement hit hard, echoing what everyone had witnessed. Neighbors who'd lived there for years began sharing their own stories with reporters, times they'd seen the teen helping elderly residents with their groceries, tutoring younger kids from the neighborhood, or simply greeting everyone with a warm smile on his morning walks to school. Mrs. Chen, still shaken by what she'd witnessed, spoke through tears to another reporter. "I've watched that boy grow up. He shovels my sidewalk every winter without being asked. How do we explain to our children that doing everything right still might not be enough to keep them safe?" As the teen was carefully helped into the ambulance, his father climbing in beside him, the gathered crowd fell silent. The flashing lights painted everything in surreal bursts of red and blue. Officer Miller watched them leave, the weight of his actions visible in his slumped shoulders. The police chief arrived next, immediately surrounded by press and concerned citizens demanding answers. His usual practiced responses felt hollow in the face of such clear evidence. This wasn't a case that could be dismissed with vague promises of internal investigation. Not with dozens of witnesses, multiple videos, and a victim whose family had the resources to demand real accountability. "I want to be clear," the chief stated, facing the cameras. "What happened here tonight is not in line with our department's values or training. We will conduct a thorough investigation, and appropriate action will be taken." But the neighbors weren't satisfied with standard responses. Mr. Thompson, the retired judge, stepped forward. "Chief, we need more than just words this time. That young man did everything right, and he still ended up in an ambulance. How many others without his family's resources have faced similar treatment with no recourse?" The question hung in the air as news helicopters circled overhead, their spotlights illuminating the scene like an accusing finger pointed at a system that had failed yet again. Social media was already exploding with the videos, each new post adding to the growing outrage. As the crowd slowly dispersed and the news crews packed up their equipment, the quiet neighborhood street felt forever changed. The incident had ripped away the comfortable illusion that such things don't happen here, forcing everyone to confront uncomfortable truths about bias, privilege, and justice. The teen's backpack still lay on the sidewalk, his books scattered around it, silent witnesses to a moment that would spark a movement for change in their community. Tomorrow would bring press conferences, protests, and demands for reform, but tonight, a family dealt with the painful reality that success and status couldn't protect their child from prejudice. Within an hour of the incident, the hospital's emergency department buzzed with activity. The teen sat on an examination bed, his father standing nearby, their family doctor having rushed in to personally oversee his care. The taser's marks were being photographed and documented while medical staff ran tests to ensure there was no internal damage. Outside the private room, reporters gathered in the hospital lobby, held back by security. The story had exploded across social media, with the shocking videos reaching millions of views. The hospital's PR team worked overtime, fielding calls from national news networks wanting updates on the young victim's condition. The father's phone wouldn't stop ringing. Calls from business partners, community leaders, civil rights attorneys, and even the mayor's office. But he focused solely on his son, watching as each medical test came back, his relief growing as they confirmed no serious physical injuries. "Dad," the teen spoke softly, looking up from the hospital bed, "remember when you told me that success would protect us? That if we worked hard enough, lived in the right neighborhood, did everything right?" His voice trailed off, the unfinished thought hanging heavy in the air. The father's composed exterior cracked slightly. He reached for his son's hand, struggling to find the right words. I believed that if we achieved enough, if we proved ourselves beyond any doubt." He stopped, the reality of their situation making those old beliefs feel hollow. Their private conversation was interrupted by the arrival of the police chief himself, who had requested an urgent meeting. He entered the room looking noticeably uncomfortable, his usual authority diminished by the circumstances. "Sir," the chief addressed the father, "I want to personally apologize for Officer Miller's actions tonight. His behavior was completely unacceptable and doesn't reflect our department's values." The father's response was measured but firm. "Chief, this isn't about one officer's actions. This is about a system that made him feel confident enough to tase a child who was simply walking home. My son could have straight A's, perfect behavior, and a father who runs half the businesses in this city. But none of that mattered the moment Officer Miller saw him." The chief shifted uncomfortably as the father continued, his voice gaining strength. "You know what the most painful part is? We did everything right. We moved to the right neighborhood. My son works twice as hard to be seen as half as good. And still, he ended up on that sidewalk." Hospital security interrupted with news that more press had arrived, including crews from national networks. The story was growing bigger by the minute. Videos of the incident had been shared by celebrities and civil rights leaders, drawing attention from across the country. The teen's father, known for his business acumen and calm demeanor, made a decision that would change everything. "Chief, I could easily turn this into a legal battle that would drain your department's resources and end several careers. But that's not what our community needs." He stood straighter, years of leadership experience evident in his bearing. "Instead, I want to work with you to make real changes. Not just diversity training or body cameras. We need fundamental reform in how officers are recruited, trained, and held accountable. My son deserves that. Every child deserves that." The chief, realizing the opportunity being offered despite his department's massive failure, nodded slowly. "What do you propose?" As they began discussing potential reforms, the teen watched his father with newfound admiration. Despite the trauma of the evening, despite the anger and hurt, his father was choosing to channel everything into creating positive change. Outside the hospital room, the world waited for updates. News channels ran the tasing videos on repeat, social media exploded with commentary, and community leaders prepared for what would become a watershed moment in their city's history. What started as one officer's biased action was about to catalyze a movement for genuine police reform, driven by a father's determination to protect not just his son, but all children from similar injustice. The night's events had revealed painful truths about privilege, prejudice, and power. But they had also created an opportunity for real transformation, if those in positions of authority were brave enough to seize it. The morning after the incident, the city woke up to a different reality. Local news stations interrupted their regular programming to show aerial footage of peaceful protesters gathering outside the police department. Parents stood with their children, holding signs that read, "Could have been my son," and "Books, not tasers." The teen's father stepped out of his company's downtown office building, where he'd just finished an emergency board meeting. His phone buzzed constantly with messages of support from business leaders across the country. But what caught his attention was a text from his son, who was resting at home. "Dad, everyone at school is talking about it. They're planning a walkout." Inside the police department, Officer Miller sat in a conference room, watching the videos of his actions for the first time. The footage was damning, showing clearly how he'd escalated the situation without cause. His supervisor paused the video and looked at him. "Help us understand what you saw that night that made you react this way." Miller stared at the frozen image on the screen, seeing now what he'd missed in the moment. Just a kid walking home from studying. His chest felt tight as he realized no explanation would justify his actions. I made assumptions. I didn't see a 14-year-old honor student. I just saw." He couldn't finish the sentence, but he didn't need to. Everyone in the room understood the ugly truth he was finally confronting about his own biases. Meanwhile, at the local high school, students poured out of their classrooms despite administrators' attempts to maintain normal schedules. The teen's classmates, many of whom had never participated in any form of protest before, led the charge. Their young voices carried across the school grounds. This has to stop. This has to change. Local business owners along the protest route placed water bottles and snacks outside their shops for the demonstrators. Mrs. Chen, the neighbor who'd witnessed the incident, brought homemade signs to share. The retired judge, Mr. Thompson, walked alongside the students, offering legal knowledge to anyone who asked. Back at the family's home, the teen sat with his mother, watching the news coverage. His phone kept lighting up with messages from friends and classmates checking on him. "Mom," he said quietly, "I think something's different this time. People who never spoke up before are speaking up now." The police chief called an emergency press conference. Standing before a wall of microphones, he made an unprecedented announcement. After reviewing all evidence, Officer Miller has been placed on immediate unpaid leave. But more importantly, we are launching a complete overhaul of our department's training and accountability measures. Social media erupted with the news. Videos of the incident had reached millions of views, spawning countless discussions about privilege, power, and policing. But unlike many viral moments that fade quickly, this one was leading to actual change. The father received another call, this time from the mayor's office. They wanted him to lead a new civilian oversight committee for the police department. His business experience, community connections, and personal stake in the matter made him the perfect choice to bridge the gap between law enforcement and the community. Local community centers opened their doors for town hall meetings where residents could share their experiences and suggestions for reform. Young people, energized by the students' walkout, organized their own youth advisory council to ensure their voices would be heard in the reform process. As evening fell again on the city, the peaceful protests continued by candlelight. The teen watched from his window as people of all ages and backgrounds marched past their house. Some carried signs with his story, but many carried signs telling their own stories. Tales of similar encounters that had gone unheard until now. His father came home late, tired but determined. "Son," he said, sitting down beside him, "sometimes change comes from the most painful moments. What happened to you was wrong, but look what it's starting. People are finally ready to listen, ready to act, ready to change." The teen nodded, understanding that his story had become something bigger than himself. It had become a catalyst for the change his community had needed for so long. As he watched the candlelit procession continue past their window, he felt something he hadn't expected to feel so soon after the incident: hope. In the weeks following the incident, the teen's father emerged as a powerful voice for change, but in an unexpected way. Instead of using his influence to demand punishment, he focused on transformation. The first meeting of the newly formed Police Reform Committee filled the City Hall's largest conference room, with people lining the walls and spilling into the hallway. The father stood at the podium, his voice steady and clear. "We're not here to point fingers or assign blame. We're here to rebuild trust between our police department and our community. This isn't about my son anymore. It's about making sure no parent gets that phone call. No child feels that fear." Officer Miller, still on unpaid leave, had requested to speak at the meeting. As he approached the microphone, the room fell silent. His hands shook slightly as he adjusted his civilian clothes, the first time many had seen him out of uniform. "I've spent the last 3 weeks thinking about that night," he began, his voice thick with emotion. "I've watched the video hundreds of times. I've read every comment, every post. But what really changed me was watching my own kids watch that video, seeing their faces as they realized what their father had done." The room remained quiet as he continued, "I'm not here to ask for my job back. I'm here to be part of the solution. To help other officers recognize their biases before they lead to actions we can't take back." The teen's father, watching from his seat, nodded slowly. This was exactly the kind of honest self-reflection the community needed to move forward. The committee presented their initial proposals: new de-escalation training programs, community engagement requirements for all officers, and a civilian review board with real power to investigate complaints. But the most innovative idea came from an unexpected source: the teen himself. He'd been working with his classmates to develop a youth ambassador program, where high school students would meet regularly with police officers in casual settings, playing basketball, sharing meals, having honest conversations about their experiences and fears. The problem isn't just about policies, the teen explained to the committee. It's about seeing each other as human beings. How can you fear someone you've played basketball with? How can you stereotype someone who shared their dreams with you? The idea caught fire. Other schools in the district wanted to start their own programs. The police chief, seeing the potential, immediately approved officer participation as part of their regular community service hours. Meanwhile, Officer Miller had begun speaking at police academies across the state, sharing his story as a cautionary tale. "I thought I was one of the good ones," he would tell them. "I had black friends. I coached diverse youth sports teams. But that night showed me that good intentions aren't enough. We have to actively work to recognize and challenge our own biases." The local news stations, which had initially focused on the scandal, now covered the positive changes emerging from it. They filmed youth ambassador meetings, interviewed reformed officers, and highlighted the community's collaborative approach to healing. One evening, as the father and son watched these reports together, the teen turned to his dad. "You know what's different about this time?" he asked. "We're not just talking about what went wrong. We're actually building something better." His father smiled, pride evident in his eyes. The path they'd chosen wasn't easy. It would have been simpler to file lawsuits and demand firings. But they'd chosen to transform anger into action, fear into hope. The committee meetings continued, drawing larger crowds each time. People who'd never been politically active before found themselves engaged in shaping their community's future. The Youth Ambassador Program expanded to include arts projects, community service initiatives, and mentorship opportunities. What had started as a traumatic encounter on a quiet suburban street was evolving into a model for other communities facing similar challenges. The father's business acumen, combined with grassroots community involvement and genuine commitment from law enforcement, was creating lasting change. As another successful committee meeting ended, the father watched his son chatting with a group of young police cadets. They were laughing together, planning their next basketball game. In that moment, he saw the future they were building. One relationship, one conversation, one change at a time. 6 months after that fateful evening, the city had transformed in ways few could have predicted. The teen stood at a podium in the city hall, addressing a packed room of community members, police officers, and local leaders. His voice, once shaken by fear, now carried strength and purpose. "When I was Taste that night, I thought my world was ending," he began, looking across the diverse crowd. "But today, I realize it was actually the beginning of something extraordinary. Look around this room. Look at who's sitting next to you. 6 months ago, many of us wouldn't even have spoken to each other." The Youth Ambassador Program he'd created had spread to every high school in the city. Weekly basketball games between teens and officers had become community events, drawing crowds and building bridges. The sight of police officers shooting hoops with local kids had become normal, replacing the tension that once filled these same streets. Officer Miller, now working as a police training consultant, sat in the audience. He'd spent months helping develop new training programs focused on bias recognition and community engagement. His honest account of his own transformation had become a powerful teaching tool. The teen's father stepped up next, holding a thick folder. "Today, we're presenting our 6-month progress report," he announced. "Our emergency calls involving force are down 60%. Citizen complaints have dropped by 70%. But the numbers I'm most proud of. We've had over 1,000 young people participate in our Youth Ambassador Program." The police chief stood to share his own update. Under the new policies, every officer now spent at least 4 hours a week in community engagement activities, not as authority figures, but as neighbors and friends. They helped at homework clubs, coached sports teams, and shared meals with local families. Mrs. Chen, who'd witnessed the original incident, wiped tears from her eyes as she watched the proceedings. Her corner store had become a regular meeting spot for the Youth Ambassador program. Who would have thought, she whispered to Mr. Thompson beside her, that such beauty could come from such pain. The teen continued his speech, but our work isn't finished. This is just the beginning. Next month, we're launching a scholarship program for young people who want to pursue careers in law enforcement or community service. We're calling it the Bridge Builders Scholarship. The audience broke into applause as he explained how local businesses, led by his father's company, had pledged to fund the scholarships. The goal was to create a new generation of police officers who came from and understood the communities they served. A young police cadet stood up to share her experience. 6 months ago, I almost quit the academy. I didn't think I could make a difference. But being part of this program showed me that change is possible when we're brave enough to try. The meeting ended with an announcement that their program was being studied by cities across the country. What had started as a response to tragedy had become a model for community transformation. After the ceremony, the teen and his father walked home together through the same streets where everything had changed. Kids played basketball with officers at the community center. Neighbors chatted with patrol officers like old friends. The atmosphere felt different, lighter, more hopeful. "Dad," the teen said, stopping to watch a group of young officers playing soccer with local kids, "remember when you said success would protect us? I think we got it wrong before. Real success isn't just about what we achieve for ourselves. It's about what we can build together." His father nodded, watching as another police car pulled up to the soccer game. The officers inside didn't hesitate to join in, their presence drawing smiles instead of fear. "You're right," he replied, "and look what we've built." As they continued walking, the setting sun painted the sky in brilliant colors. The street where a teenager once lay tased had become a symbol not of division, but of transformation. The pain hadn't been forgotten, but it had been channeled into purpose. And in that purpose, they had found something powerful. Hope for a better future, built one relationship at a time.